How is everybody doing today? Nice. Oh, I'm sorry you're a little bit tired. I hope that the hackathon has been pretty cool and fun thus far. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Hi, everybody. Welcome to APIs 101 with Postman, where we're gonna learn some API essentials today. So before we jump right into it, I'll start by introducing myself. I'm May. I'm the Student Community Manager at Postman for student programs in the US. I've been here about 3 months exactly as of today, and I really love working with students. Prior to working here, I was at code.org and GitHub Education, so I've always been in the tech ed realm, and now I get to do fun things like lead workshops and just talk to students like you, which I love doing. So here's our agenda for the day. We're going to go over an introduction to what APIs are and also what Postman is. Sorry. And then we'll talk a little bit more about why people are using APIs, what's the purpose of them in software development. And we'll talk about getting into the weeds of it with requests and responses. We'll have the opportunity to try some things out ourselves. I'll give you some follow-up resources that you can use at the end, and then we'll have time for Q&A at the end. But if you have any questions at all, please feel free to put them in the chat during the session. So, what is an API? An API stands for Application Programming Interface, and it allows services to communicate with each other. So over the years, software has become a lot more complex and a lot more collaborative. And so there's more software and more developers now than there's ever been at any point in history. So with that much software being created, developers no longer need to create every single service that they want to use from scratch. They can use something that someone else has made. APIs allow us to do that. APIs allow developers access to different data from different services, and they don't need to have any prior knowledge at all of how that code base has been implemented in order to use it. So I'm going to have a drink. So if I want to use the Twitter API, for example, to get information, maybe I have my own social media like analytics tracker, and I'm a social media influencer. So maybe I want to get all of my analytics from, say, Twitter, TikTok, Twitch, different sites like that. I don't have to go log into each individual one and manually pull that data. I can use the API that each of these services has to just programmatically pull that data. And I don't need to know what Twitter was built in or what TikTok was built in order to get this information, because an API is exactly that, an interface. And so I don't need to know all of the details in order to just get the data, because this interface allows me to have direct access to the data. So one way that we can think about APIs is as a digital restaurant. So if I go to my favorite restaurant and I want to make an order, I can't just waltz on to the back of the kitchen and make my demands. I have to talk to either a person at the front or I have to talk to a waiter. And when I do that, the waiter is communicating between me and the kitchen, right? I look at the menu, I see what my options are, and I say, okay, this is what I want. And I tell the waiter, and then the waiter goes back to the kitchen with my order. Now, the waiter is going to come back either with my order or to tell me, hey, actually, we're out of what you ordered today. Can you ask for something else? And so in this case, the waiter is acting as an API. The waiter is pinging back and forth between someone who's making requests and someone who has the data, the goods to give. In some other scenarios, waiters really act as APIs because they also have authorization in a way, right? If I go to a bar and I want to order a drink, I need to show my ID first. Before the waiter can even place my order, the waiter needs to see my ID and know that I am the legal age, I am authorized to order alcohol, before being able to go and make that request to the bartender or whoever's making the drink. So in this way, waiters also act as APIs because they're handling not just orders, but making sure that people who are making requests are actually making that kind of request they should be making. So that was a very high level overview. Let's look at APIs from a little more technical of a view. So if I am going to make a post on Instagram, for example, I first open up my Instagram app, and there's a lot of moving pieces here. There's a lot of work that goes into just making a post. First, the Instagram app has to communicate with the camera app on my phone in order to take the photo. And then once I do that, the photo is taken, it's sent back through Instagram, or in the case of the user, it's kind of always shown through Instagram. While I'm on Instagram, I can add any additional filters I want. The automatic filter that is put on by Instagram is already there. And then I can add my text, all of that kind of stuff, make all my changes. And when I'm ready to post it, I click post, and my post, before it reaches anybody else, Instagram, the app on my phone, sends that post to a remote server. So probably a location on the cloud that Instagram has. And then from there, it's shown to everybody in the wider social network. So there's a lot of moving pieces here. How many APIs do you think are being used? And you can put that in the chat. You can tell me through your mic. I love guesses. Let's see here. 3. Yes, exactly. How do I pronounce your name? Is it Manjot?
Yes, it is.
Okay. So yeah, Manjot has it right. There's 3. Can you tell me what are the 3 APIs we're using, just kind of in general in this scenario? It's also okay if you don't want to. There are, so like you said, there's 3. Let's see here. The one from the camera, one from Instagram, and one from the server. It's okay that it was a guess because you guessed correctly. And yeah, you're correct here. We're communicating with the hardware API on the phone, the camera API. Instagram, the app, has its own API that's being used to communicate both with the camera and with the remote server. And the remote server has another API in order to actually receive information. And so the reason that we don't consider another API between the remote server and the social network is because the social network is actually hosted on that remote server. So we're not moving it between 2 different services. We're just kind of moving data that's already there to the place that's supposed to go. Great job. So there's really an API for everything. And when I say that, I mean everything. Some of the services that you've probably used before, like Spotify, Twitter, Discord, and definitely Google, all have APIs that are accessible for developers to use. But not every platform, it's not just platforms that have APIs. There's also APIs for different services. My favorite example of this is the cat API that shows you different pictures of cats. But there's some other services that use APIs as well, like YouTube to MP3, which changes YouTube links to MP3 files, and an Open Weather Map, which has open access data for weather data all across the world. So the fun thing about APIs is that it really turns software development into Lego blocks. You know, instead of having to write everything from scratch, we can really take a lot of bits and pieces from different services that we want to use and stack those on top of each other to create our overall piece of software. So in the most driest, most technical terms, what is an API? So an API is a mediator between a client and a server to provide access to data and services. In this case, the client can be really anything. The client is going to make requests. So in the restaurant example, I am the one making request to the kitchen. So I make that request to the waiter, who's the API. In our Instagram example, there's different things trying to communicate with each other. And so the Instagram app is an example of the client because it's making all of these requests to the camera, for example, and then to the remote server. Notice we're not getting requests from the camera or getting requests from the remote server. So a client can really be anything from a mobile app to a website to even your web browser. And as we're going to use today, Postman. And so we're going to be using Postman as our client, and we're going to make some API requests so that we can get some data, send some data, update it, and also delete it. But before we move any more, what is Postman? So Postman is a collaborative API development platform, and it really streamlines and simplifies the process of using, developing, and testing APIs by putting it into this nice little UI. In the old days of working with APIs, you have to use this command line tool called curl. And so if you've ever worked with a command line before, then you know that it can be a real pain sometimes, especially if you make any mistakes or there's something that you need to change in whatever you had just typed. And it's really difficult to kind of parse through all the information sometimes. Command lines are very powerful because they can show us everything going on in the behind the scenes. But sometimes that makes it really difficult to parse out the information that you actually need for that moment. So Postman came along to kind of wrap everything that's in curl into a nice little UI so that you're able to easily make your request to an API and also easily parse through the information that you're getting back with a couple of tools that help you visualize it better too. So before we move on into the weeds of it, are there any questions about APIs? Perfect. Let's keep going. So let's talk about making requests. Requests are how we interact with an API. And there's three main methods, or there's three main ingredients for making a request. We have our method, which is basically the action. It's what we want to get out of this interaction. We have the address, which is an endpoint, typically a URL. And the address is basically where our interaction is going to take place. And then the path is kind of like knocking on the right door, going to the right apartment within a building to say, hey, can you process this? Here's your piece of mail. Or if we're maybe in a college environment, for example, going to the right department with the right question. And we're going to talk more about this in a moment. So HTTP methods are how we specify what we want from the API. So we have a lot of different methods that we can use, but I'm just going to focus on the four main ones. If you've ever done website development, created a whole web service, this will probably look really familiar to you because we have get, which is how we get information, post, which is how we send information, put, which is how we update information, and delete, which is how we delete information. And if you've worked on a full web service before, you might recognize that these are very similar to the CRUD principles: create, read, update, delete. Next up, we have endpoints and paths. So this is where our interaction with the API takes place. So an endpoint is really just a channel of communication for the API. One way that we can think of this, I like to think about it as an address because it's just kind of the general place where you're sending something. So if I'm sending a piece of mail, say to a college campus, I'm sending it to this college campus. The path is like a sub-destination on that endpoint, which is where whatever you're requesting or trying to send can be heard and executed. So if the address, if we're talking about this in a college campus terms, if I'm sending a piece of mail, say I live in Seattle, so maybe I'm trying to send something to the University of Washington to the computer science program. So the endpoint is UW. The path is the computer science department, because I don't want to just send my inquiry to the entire school. I also don't want to send it to the wrong place. I don't want to send my question about computer science to the humanities department. I want to send it to the computer science department. So that's kind of what a path does. It's the right place to listen to and handle your request. So in this example on the screen, we have linkedin.com. That's the endpoint. So this is where we would be working with the API. This would be working with LinkedIn's API. And then we have the path feed. So the feed just shows you, well, a feed when you log in to LinkedIn. And so there's a couple of things you can do on that feed. I can get all of the posts from my feed. I can send a post, which will add it to my feed. And I can update and delete my own post. However, I can't do that to other people's posts. And the path is making sure of that when I'm, trying to make a request with the API. So now that we've talked about the main pieces of making a request, let's talk about how we kind of customize our request to be a little more specific. So there's a couple of details that we can add. Number one is parameters. These are query parameters. This is how we filter out information to get exactly what we want. So if I work at Amazon and I need to update a customer's account, I'm not going to just get all of the customers. That's a lot of people to have to sort through. I'm going to use a query parameter when I'm doing that GET request so that I can specify maybe the person's last name, and I want to specify their account number, but maybe there's different tables associated with this particular user. So I want to get even more specific in my details. So maybe I don't want to go to their account details. I want to get their orders. So I'd have another query parameter for specifying orders. And maybe I just want to get orders from the last week, not all of their orders. So I can also specify that in my query parameter. So it really allows me to filter out all of the noise to get as specific as possible in my details. Next up, we have authorization. So authorization is a very important topic when it comes to APIs, but it's also a very large topic. And so we're not going to be going through all of the ins and outs of authorization in this session. In future sessions that Postman's hosting, we will be talking more about authorization though. So one of the main ways that we use authorization with an API is just to make sure that you have the privileges to and permissions to be doing the things you're trying to do. One way that developers do this is through an API key. This just gives you access to a lot of basic operations in the API. And it's really a way for developers to protect themselves as well, to make sure, hey, if you're violating the terms of service, we need to be able to take away your access to this API. So they could revoke your API key. Another way is just to make sure that people aren't doing too many requests at once, because that can be very damaging to certain platforms. So an API key is also used to rate limit different developers as well. But that's just one piece of authorization. Let's say I'm on Twitter and I want to send a tweet through an account, but I'm doing that programmatically with a program on the back end. So I'm going to need the right authorization to prove that I actually have access to this account and that I'm not just sending tweets through anybody's old account. And more intense authorization called OAuth, most commonly, that's the most commonly used, comes into play here, because you don't just need an API key, you'll need access tokens and access IDs, a lot of different identifiers just to prove that you have the permissions to actually be doing what you're trying to do. And so because there's so much that goes into that, it's really a security risk as well. So that brings me into the next part about specifying detail in our request, which is headers and body. So headers are how we send metadata. It's especially relevant when we're sending authorization data, like access tokens, client IDs, that kind of stuff, because we don't want to put this in the URL of our request. We want to make sure that it's hidden and it's secure. So you would put that information in the header. The body is where we send more information. So if we're going to create something new on a server, say I'm going to create a new account, I'm going to do a post request to do that, and I'm going to use the body of that request to send all of the details that the server needs in order to honor that request. So when we are making requests, we're not just calling out to the void, because in this case, the void is calling back to us. We get a response from the void. So responses are how we get information back from a request. Depending on what kind of request we made, we'll get a different kind of response, which is why it's very important that we pay attention to the status code. There's two main elements to a response. The most important is the status code. The status code just gives you at a glance information about how your request went down. So 200 would mean, okay, everything was good. 201 would mean, hooray, you successfully created something. And 404, which you've probably come in contact with just on the interwebs, means not found, it's not here. You've probably also come in contact with 403, forbidden, you don't have access to that. These status codes are very important, and you'll see why once we get into actually doing things. And then responses also have body data. So if I do a GET request, I'm going to get a response back, hopefully that has body data, because that's the information, that's my way of accessing the information that I was requesting. So this is how responses give us back information. And usually it's in JSON format, but sometimes it can also be in HTML or XML. So we're going to go ahead and make some requests now. Let me copy a link and paste it in the chat. So if you don't have a Postman account, that's okay. It doesn't take very long to make one. We're just going to be forking this collection. Before I get too in the weeds of this, let me tell you a little bit about what's going on this page. We are in a public workspace. So if you've ever used GitHub before, a public workspace is kind of like a public repository. It's really like your collection of different projects or different files and folders related to one project. And so those folders, you'll see on this left-hand side, there's a bunch of folders. These are called collections, and collections are what they sound like. They're a collection of things. In this case, those things are API requests. So we're gonna fork this collection, basics of API. And like when you're creating a new branch in GitHub, or when you're forking a repository, you'll give it a label. So I'll say this hackathon, and that will be my label. And I have to choose a workspace where I will be putting my fork. So I'm going to click on this drop down. You probably will only have the option, unless you have other workspaces available, to put this in my workspace, which is totally fine. You can do that. I have a specific workspace for these kinds of workshops, so I'm going to put it there. And then I'm going to click on fork collection, and it's going to reload the page. And when the page reloads, it shows me that I am on my workspace using my forked collection, and I can see my forked label there. So let me know when we're good to move forward. I want to make sure everyone has a chance to get this set up. And also let me know if I need to go back in any steps. All right, are we good to move forward? Awesome. let's keep going. So we do have something very important here, which is this documentation. If it's not open on your screen and your screen looks like this, there's this little menu bar over here. Go ahead and click on the little bar that says documentation and it will pop up. The documentation is essentially the menu for what you can do with an API. So it tells you all of the options, what your options are, and how to get there. So this has the documentation for the API that we're going to be using today. It's a joke API. And so it also has documentation for what the path is that we're going to use, how to do different requests. And throughout the rest of this workshop, I'll be referring to this documentation just to help you get a feel for how things work when we're working with an API. But before we do that, I'm going to add a new request into my collection. So I'm going to click on the 3 dots. And I'm going to say add request. I'm going to call it get Google. So before I move forward, let me talk a little bit about what's going on this page. So this is our request pane. This is where we can build our request for the API. And this bottom half of the page is the response pane. This is where we will get the response and response information back when we do our request. So I'm going to do a get request to google.com. I'm going to click send. And I get a response back. I get status 200 OK, and it is HTML that I get back. So I'm getting HTML back, which I mentioned before. That's an option. You can actually view this in a different way. We have a couple of options here. First is raw. It just puts everything into one string. That's not very useful for right now because this is a web page. But if I click on preview, it will show me a rendered version of the Google site from that response data. And so one thing I want to point out is that whenever we go onto a website, just like typing a website into the URL bar on your browser and hitting enter, you're doing a GET request because every web service has a built-in API in order for you to be able to access it from one. And so we're already working with APIs every day and we don't even know it. So this is cool. I can get the Google web page, but I'm not just here to look at a web page because that's not what we use Google for. We use it to search. So I'm going to add a query parameter so that I can actually send a search request. So under this tab in the request pane, I have params, and our query parameters are in a key value pairing system. So the key is Q for query, and I'll put Postman as my value. And now I will click send. Now, notice when I do that, everything was fine. I got status 200 OK, but the word Postman just went into the search box. It didn't actually show me the search results. Does anyone have any clue for why? Just any guesses for why I didn't get the actual search results when I sent this request? And you can type it in the chat. You can use your mic. See, didn't press enter. Well, we did press enter, just not on this web page. It's not the right request. There's no argument in the URL. We're getting really close. Another query parameter. Almost. So remember before when I said that endpoints are kind of the address, but paths are sending your request to the right person to be able to handle it? In this case, we're just sending this request to google.com, but that's the endpoint. The actual path to be able to do a search is /search. So if I send now, I'll see that I actually get all of the search results for Postman on Google when I set it up that way. And there's a way that we can test this too. If I go to Google and I say Postman. Notice it's just google.com here, but when I press enter, that /search path gets added, because when we're hitting search, it's redirecting us to the correct path and then doing that query. And there's a lot of extra stuff that's added at the top. We can see the actual query parameter over here. There's a couple of different trackers and such that Google adds. So if I go to google.com/search and $Q Postman, I will also get the same result as I did from using Postman directly. So this is just one example of how we work with APIs every day, and we don't even realize it. One of the things I think is really cool about APIs is it shows you how so many services that we use are built. A lot of these platforms feel like, because of how massive and popular they are, it's really hard to imagine how any of it was actually created or built. But in this case, like, using an API shows us that it's just using the same stuff that we're going to be making and we're going to be interacting with every day. It's really the building blocks of technology. So I'm going to go back a few steps just to reintroduce our API that we're going to be using. So if you click on this top bar here, Basics of API, it should take you back to the documentation. We're going to be using a joke API. And so this API doesn't require any authorization. We don't have to worry about keys or anything like that. We will be sending data that everybody can see. And with that, we're also going to be, we're basically just using live data to send jokes. Our endpoint is included here. We can also directly go to that endpoint. And this is what the homepage looks like. So if I go to get joke, and I just type the endpoint here, I get the home page. It can be a little bit slow sometimes. There we go. So I get the home page here. If I go to the joke path on that endpoint, I get a random joke back. And if I click send, it shows me a random joke. It doesn't just show me all jokes at once, just one random joke. So if I want to be able to get a specific joke, I know there's 4 jokes starting from 0 to 3. I can do another / to get a specific joke. So I'll just say 1, I'll hit send. And if I click send a couple of times, you'll notice that it's not changing into anything random because it's just showing me the one joke that I requested. What is hardware? The part of the computer which you can kick. Perfect. Okay, so that's cool, but I want to be able to add my own joke now. So I'm going to click on those 3 dots again, and I'm going to add another request. I'm going to say make joke. And then I'm going to click on this drop down here and select post out of my options for methods. And then let's just take the endpoint and path from the get request. And if you're just copying and pasting that, remove the 1 at the end because the path that we're using is just joke. So let's go back. Oh, you'll notice that at the top here, it says post, but on the side here, it says get. Save your request and that will update. So it says post next to it. So let's go back to the documentation to see what we need in order to make a post request here. So the body for post input is like this. So I mentioned before that we use JSON format in our responses a lot of the time, but we also use JSON format when we're sending information in our request. So it's between 2 brackets because it's an object, and also uses a key value pairing system. So our keys, things that are basically syntactically required for this post request, are ID, author, joke, and source. And then everything on this right-hand side of the colon is the value. So these are all values that we will input. you can go ahead and just copy and paste this. And then in the request pane where it says params, there's a whole line of options. Go ahead and select body. And this part is very important. Select raw, because we're just getting the raw data, but go to this dropdown where it says text and select JSON. If you don't select this, it won't know to render it as JSON and you will get an error. So if I try to just send this as is, I get an error because joke with ID 1 already exists. So I need to add a new ID. So I can go ahead and do that. I'll do 44. And then let's change the author. So I'll just say May. And I'm not big on creating jokes myself. I'm much bigger on doing puns. So I'll just say perfect. And then for the source, I'll put me because I'm the source. And I'll go ahead and click send. So when I do that, I get the status tool 1 created. So hooray, I successfully created a joke. And the response, the body of the response just sends back to me what I put in the body of my request to let me know this is the information that I had sent in when I created it. So if I go to get joke, I can actually go back and see this joke that I just created. So I'll go back to get joke, and instead of looking for the joke number 1, I'll look for joke 44 because that's the ID. And sometimes this can be a little bit slow. So if you're looking for a joke that you just added, you might get a 404 error a couple of times and we'll have to resend. In my case, it's already there. I don't have to worry about that. 200 okay, and I can see, hooray, there's my joke. I got it. Did anybody create a joke or a pun and would like to drop the ID for it in the chat? It's also okay if you don't want to. We can come back to this. Right now, I'm actually going to update my joke that I made because there's a little bit of missing information. For example, the author doesn't have my last name. It just says May. So let's change that. I'm going to add a new request. I'll say update joke. And so here we are with our list of options. Does anybody remember which method I need to use to update? Which of these methods up here I should use? We just did post to send information, but now we're trying to update. Yeah, put snaps to everyone who mentioned that in the chat. So put is the method I'm going to be using. Let me save this real quick so it updates over here. I'm just going to copy and paste my endpoint and URL. And if I try sending this request as is, I get an error because I did not actually put anything in the body to send and update. So I'm going to go back to the documentation. And so the body for post and put looks like this. So in the case of doing a put request, I actually need to enter all of the information. I can't just enter the ID of what I'm trying to update and the little piece of information I want to update. I need to have all of this information. So I can actually just go back to my post request and copy and paste that body into the body of my put request. So I'll go to body, raw, change the dropdown to JSON. I'll paste that in there, and now I'll make the changes that I want to make. So I'll add my last name under author, and I put me as the source, but those are also my initials. So I'll just turn the E into an uppercase. And now if I send, it's being slow right now. Let me send a couple of times. There we go. I get status 204, no content. This is an example of why status codes are really, really important. I need to be able to look at the status code to see, oh, I'm not actually getting a response back from the server when I did this. So no content is what I get back. But 204, it lets me know that I did a good job. Everything went through as it was supposed to. I'm just not getting an actual body response from the request, which is fine. So if I go back to my get joke request so that I can get a joke and get my specific joke, it's going to scream that the joke is not found because it's being slow. I'm going to send this a couple of times. I know you're there. There we go. And it will show my updated joke. So my updated entry. So it says may error this time, and it has my initials. So I have now gotten a joke. I have sent a joke. I have updated one. Now what comes up must come down. I have to delete it now. So I will add a new request. Delete joke. Select delete from the dropdown, and I will just head back over to the documentation to see what we need to do in order to delete a joke. So include ID in the URL, like joke/10, where 10 is the ID of the joke for a delete request. So if I go to my get request and I copy and paste this link with my path and my specific ID, that's essentially all that I need to do in order to delete this joke, which is another example of how some paths can handle multiple kinds of requests. For example, we can't do a post request to this exact link because 44 is in the way, but we can get this specific joke and we can delete this specific joke. So I'm going to click on send. And I'll say status 200 OK. Tells me that the joke with the ID 44 is deleted. So if I go to get joke now and I try to get the same joke, I get 404 not found, joke not found. So these are the ins and outs of working with an API. Let me head back to my presentation. We learned about the essentials to making a request. We talked about methods, endpoints, and paths, as well as body data, so that we were able to send as well as ask and receive. And we went over the 4 main methods, get, post, put, and delete. So if you would like to continue your API knowledge journey, you can create your own public workspace with a collection using any API of your choice and create it on postman.com. Send it to us with this link. I will put this link in the chat in a little bit, and we will send you cool swag for the coolest project. So swag is at stake here. I also have this list of APIs that you can try out, and I'll be sending this slide deck to the organizer so that they can share it out with you. I have something in the chat. Yeah, there's a Studio Ghibli API. So I put together this collection of APIs that I really like. We have the Studio Ghibli API where you can get different Studio Ghibli information. So you could work with this one if you wanted. We have Smash Lounge, which gives you different API information, or an API that gives you different information about Smash characters and techniques. We have my favorite, the cat API. It shows you cats. Look at that cat. That cat has babies. Beautiful. So these are just some examples, and everything is linked here. So you can check out these. If there's some other really cool APIs that you find along the way, you can also use that. Just make sure that you put it in a public workspace and send us a link to that workspace. if you'd like to take your knowledge journey even further, you can continue learning APIs as a student expert. So our student expert program is a free self-paced training. It takes anywhere between a day and a week, just depending on how much time you have to complete. In this training, you'll learn about sending more sophisticated requests. You'll learn a little bit about editing documentation, as well as writing a little bit of code inside Postman for basic test scripts, which will also allow you to pass data between requests. So you'd be taking data from a response, putting that data into a different request and utilizing it, kind of passing it between. You can even do this with 2 separate APIs while using Postman, which I think is a really cool feature. And if you become a certified student expert, you'll get an open badge that looks kind of like this. It also looks kind of like this. You can put this open badge on Twitter and LinkedIn. We've actually had a couple of students get job interviews on LinkedIn because they had their student expert badge on their LinkedIn profile, and they were able to put this under the education slot as a certification. And so on top of this, you have the option of getting good additional knowledge, getting some free education, but you also have more job opportunities if you become certified. And certified student experts have the option to join as a student leader in your community. So that is our other program where we will train you on public speaking and event organizing so that you can host workshops kind of like this one. And I will also be putting the link to this in the chat if anybody would like it. Boop, boop. Okay. So as I promised, here are some follow-up resources that you can use. We have our Learning Center, which has different documentation and how-to guides. We have our API network where you can see different APIs that people are making, different companies are making as well. Mercedes-Benz just put out their API. So if you wanted to learn how to do something with car apps, you could learn through there. And if you have any other questions that we don't answer in this workshop, you can put that in our community forum. Speaking of questions, does anybody have any questions, either about APIs, things we talked about in the workshop, Postman, anything at all? You can just put it in the chat or use your mic. Where do we submit to get swag again? Let me put that link in, because that link is also a survey link. And if you could fill that out, it would be greatly appreciated. Where will the recording be? I believe Manjot said that it would be on YouTube. Yeah. Do we have any other questions? No? All right. A student in a different workshop had told me that the reason there were no questions in that particular workshop was because I answered any questions they could have had with the presentation itself. And I was like, oh, that's wonderful. So I am going to assume that that's happening here as well. But if you have any other questions that maybe pop up later, you can feel free to email me. I'll put my email in the chat as well. And please fill out the survey form so that you can also win your chance at some swag with a public workspace. So yeah, if that's it, I will sign off now and thank you all for coming to the workshop. I hope you learned something.
Yeah, thank you for taking the time out during a Saturday to come and present this.
Yeah. No worries. All right. Thank you.
Have a good weekend.
Have a good day. Thank you. Have a good weekend as well. Bye.